Today, I'm going to settle the debate on compost tea. Is it the single greatest thing you could be making as a natural gardener, or is it complete snake oil? Stay tuned to find out. I'm Taylor. Welcome to the channel, or welcome back. Glad to have you. In this video, we're going to take a look at 3 of the biggest potential myths regarding aerated compost tea. And then we'll take a look if those myths are real or not. And as the case is for all important things in life, depending on how invested in one side of this debate or the other that you are will determine how quickly you race to the comments to offer your opinion. And I welcome those comments. Please let me know what you think about this topic. Let me know what you think about my analysis. The only thing I ask is that if you're going to comment or respond to someone's comment, please do so with kindness and respect. I know that is going to be hard for some people. Just do your best. Before we get into the 3 myths, I want to give a simple explanation of what compost tea, specifically aerated compost tea, is, and also do a brief explanation of how to make it. Compost tea is an aerated solution made by hanging a fine mesh bag of compost in a bucket of water, adding a bit of food for the microbes, and then allowing the bubbler to constantly aerate the solution. The idea is that the many microbes found in the compost, when kept moist, oxygenated, and well fed, will multiply rapidly, creating a sort of super brew that can then be transferred to a sprayer and then applied to plants in the garden. Very few gardeners dispute microbes being essential for plant health, but there are a few reasons why this homemade gardening input is disputed. And there are very likely many more grievances that folks have with aerated compost tea, but for the sake of this video, I've really boiled it down to 3 main points that these type of growers make in their case against it. Myth number 1 is that compost tea is a replacement for fertilizer. The truth, according to the doubters, is that the aerated compost tea that home gardeners are brewing and applying is not a fertilizer replacement because it contains hardly any nutrients. You can't multiply nutrients, you dummy. It's called the law of conservation of mass. So when gardeners go spraying compost tea on their plants, they're not supplying them with anything that could be considered plant food. Myth number 2 is that you're guaranteed to brew beneficial microbes if you toss compost in the bag, pop it in water, and aerate it. The truth is that there's no way to know what kind of microbes that you could be brewing. In fact, most home gardeners who make compost tea are probably just brewing up E. coli and salmonella in a bucket and then contaminated their plants without knowing. And myth number 3 is that more microbes are going to solve your plant's problems. The truth is that microbes are always at capacity in the soil. Or to put it in other words, adding more won't do anything because they'll even out very quickly and then go back to their old baseline anyway, so why waste your time? Those are the myths. Now, before we get into my take on these myths, there's a sense that I get when I read these folks writing or watch their videos, and that sense is that they're not quite representing the actual claims of those who make compost tea and teach about it, at least not very well. And this is what we'd refer to as straw manning the argument, and I'll point out what I mean. The first myth, that compost tea can be used as a fertilizer replacement, is, to my knowledge, not really a claim that anyone in the compost tea camp is making. Now, if you Google the simple question, at least if I Google, what is aerated compost tea, the AI summary tells me that aerated compost tea is a liquid fertilizer and soil amendment brewed by producing high quality compost in water while constantly injecting oxygen, often with molasses as a food for microbes. So it says right there, liquid fertilizer. But if you actually go to what the experts say about it, we find out something a little bit different. Dr. Elaine Ingham, who sadly passed away just a month prior to us filming this video, was one of the primary researchers and popularizers of aerated compost tea. And to my knowledge, she has never said anything about this being a 1-for-1 fertilizer replacement, in the sense that the nutrients in compost tea are anything extraordinary. So claiming that compost tea doesn't work to supply plants with nutrients like a fertilizer would is sort of an unfair claim because no one is really saying that. Or if they are, they likely aren't super knowledgeable on the topic. Another example of straw manning the case for compost tea is from myth 2, where apparently a lot of gardeners are too dumb to follow directions and keep compost tea properly aerated, thereby brewing pathogens in a bucket. But again, if you look at what the experts are recommending, they all say that you need to keep the stuff aerated, and they explicitly warn home brewers about anaerobic pockets within their brewing vessels as potential pathogen harbors. So I don't know if this is really a good faith critique. That said, Let's address these one at a time. Myth number one, compost tea is a liquid fertilizer replacement. Personally, I agree that this is a myth. This is not a fertilizer replacement, and in my opinion, that is completely okay. Folks may say that in this scoop of compost, there are a set number of nutrients that exist. Therefore, why not try to just use it as is? You can add nutrients to your compost tea, but again, why not just add those directly to the soil? Nothing special is happening when you brew them in an aerated tea. 1 + 1 will never equal 3. All of this is obviously true, but again, that's not the point of aerated compost tea. The point is solely the microorganisms. You can't fault chicken for not being steak. It's chicken. It never wanted to be steak. Myth number two, there's no way to know what you're brewing when you make compost tea. And this one is interesting because it's kind of true and not true. Technically, if you're not using a microscope and aren't thoroughly trained in microscopy, then yeah, you don't know what exactly is in there. On the other hand, by that logic, you technically don't know what is in your compost either, from a microbial standpoint. And if that's what they recommend using instead of aerated compost tea, why can you use that freely? And the response would be, well, if you don't keep your compost tea properly aerated, then you'd be multiplying pathogenic bacteria like E. coli. And that's a totally fair point, which also happens to be the reason why the experts say that you gotta keep it aerated. E. coli is a commonly known bacteria, largely because there are outbreaks every once in a while, which cause diarrhea, digestive distress, and in some cases, when it's bad enough, death from dehydration. But it's also commonly known because it's commonly occurring. Most E. coli is totally harmless. It's found in the guts of most animals, humans included, and it gets passed on to the soil when manure is applied. It also shows up in compost, again, when manure is an ingredient that is used. But here's the thing, if you hot compost materials, the E. coli dies off. If you don't hot compost the materials, but let your animal manure age in your compost for a few months, the potential E. coli imbalance gets sorted out as beneficial biology outcompetes it for space and nutrients. I'm not saying that there's not a potential issue, but the likelihood of E. coli contamination is pretty low if you're concerned about food safety standards. So the real complaint could maybe be more accurately made that you run the risk of multiplying pathogenic microbes if you use animal manure in your compost and then don't heat it up and don't manage the conditions of the pile, let it brew anaerobically, let it stink really bad, and then use that to make compost tea soon after making it. The thing is, so long as you're not applying this directly to your leafy greens and then picking them and eating them as a salad without washing them, you're most likely going to be fine. And that's a lot of conditions. Now, I don't say this to minimize the risk of contamination. I've had E. coli poisoning and it's not fun. I am certainly not saying that you should throw all caution in the wind and just eat your raw veggies still covered in horse poop. For safety's sake, I actually think that it's probably best to not spray down your leafy greens and then eat them. And we'll get into that a little bit more with some of my recommendations toward the end. All I want to point out here is that some folks make a really big deal out of a pretty small problem. It's a real potential, but as long as you follow the directions and the guidance of the actual experts, use healthy compost, keep it continually aerated, you're most likely going to be okay. And there's one other thing that I'll say at the end that might save you some risk, but that'll be in my personal recommendations. The other piece of this particular complaint that I find odd is when people think that you can't know what microbes are present in a compost without looking through a microscope. But in reality, we actually can make a pretty good guess with ease. If you're making compost out of plant residue, grass clippings, dried leaves, straw, and sure, animal manure, you can be fairly sure that you're going to get some bacillus, actinomycetes, and some thermophiles. On the fungal end, you've most likely got aspergillus, trichoderma, thermomyces if you're making hot compost, and mortierella if you let it age for a little while. These are broad spectrums of microorganisms, yes, but I'm really not sure why you need to know too many more of the specifics. Our ability to smell as humans has taken us a really long way in cluing us into healthy microbial cultures. If you reel back at the stench of your compost, you can make an educated guess that there are some anaerobes that have taken over the pile and it could use some management. If it smells earthy and fresh, which will become a recurring theme for this video, chances are you're going to be safe. Myth number 3 is probably one of the more interesting and nuanced claims. That being that more microbes aren't necessarily better. In fact, microbes are always present in the soil and will balance out whether new ones are added or not. This is interesting because I think it's partly true, and still pretty limited in its perspective. And here's why. What's true is that microbes need food to stay alive. Their main food sources are organic matter and minerals that make up the soil, root exudates that plants share with them in exchange for soluble nutrients, other microorganisms, and believe it or not, the air. So applying a boost of microorganisms to the soil has the potential to do very little if there is little food there for them. This is one reason why compost itself, or just organic matter, is a really useful thing to mulch your soil with, since microscopic animals and water bring it down into the soil over time and use it to feed bacteria and fungi. This is why having plants in the ground, cover crops especially, can have a hugely beneficial effect on soil biology, since the bacteria and the fungi receive energy from plant roots. So yeah, if you're gonna brew up some compost tea and spray it on bare, compact soil with nothing planted in there, it's not going to change much long term. However, paired with organic mulches and living plants, with roots in the ground, an infusion of microorganisms is hardly going to immediately disappear. In fact, there are a number of pretty interesting studies that show a direct correlation between soil organic matter, plant root exudates, and microbial biomass in healthy soil. And I'll link to those in the description if you'd like to check them out. I think it's an odd claim when people say the microbial population of a soil can't increase or change substantially with the addition of separately brewed microbial solutions such as aerated compost tea. Another piece of this claim is that when compost tea is sprayed onto plant foliage, few nutrients are imparted and absorbed, and the microbes that make it there die off with nothing to do. But again, that's one thing about microbes. They're pretty darn adaptive. I just read an article about how microbes in Antarctica do this thing called aerotrophy, which allows them to lift themselves off the cold soil and start consuming hydrogen, CO2, and methane to generate heat and feed themselves. Another way microbes feed on the nutrients in the air is when the wind blows through the trees. It blows in nitrogen that the microbes on the tree leaves catch and use to synthesize into bioavailable forms for the tree. Raindrops catch atmospheric nitrogen when it rains, providing a little foliar spray to plants, supplying nitrogen, fixing bacteria in the soil with nitrogen gas that they convert into ammonium and nitrate so the plant can uptake it. So to say that foliar microbe applications don't do anything feels a little short-sighted. Now I want to give you a couple of actionable tips here when it comes to brewing your own aerated compost teas. If you don't do this already and you're already getting great results in your garden, you really might not need to worry about investing in the equipment to make it. And by the equipment, I mean a bubbler. If you have the stuff and are already making compost tea, here are some suggestions. First of all, as stated before, make sure to the best of your ability to use a high-quality, homemade, well-aged compost as a source of microbes. Here's an example of a homemade compost that is thoroughly broken down. It's well-aged, and you can see a couple. I've got some pine cones in here that I can just toss out. You can see a few of the ingredients, but just barely. It looks very well broken down. It also passes the smell check. No sour or putrid smells. It smells earthy and fresh like earthy soil. If you want to start making your own compost, you can check out our free hot compost checklist and tracker log linked in the description, or scan the code on the screen to get access to that. Sadly, store-bought composts are likely not going to cut it unless they come with a very thorough microbial analysis. And even then, I worry about those bags baking in the sun in those sealed up plastic bags. Second, also, as stated earlier, at all costs, keep the brew aerated for the whole time. That's the whole point of making an aerated compost tea, is that it's aerated. There are anaerobic liquid ferments that we make and use. This is one that we make sure to keep aerobic. And to do that, you want to use multiple hoses to keep each part of the brewing vessel aerated. You don't want them all hanging out on one side, because then that corner back here could remain unoxygenated and you could start growing anaerobes. You can also take another step, one that I like to do, and that is to stick a hose into the bag of compost itself and fasten that with a string or a zip tie or a rubber band. If you're using this in a sprayer, you need the bag, but another option would just be putting in the compost into the vessel and then straining it out after you finished it. The best way to tell if your brew is safe for usage is smell. If it smells funky, again, sour or putrid or poopy, overly stinky in general, it most likely means that something went wrong and it wasn't properly aerated. Another caution that I can give you is actually to avoid putting in molasses. And you may or may not have heard about this before. The reason is that the molasses and the sugar in general is going to be bacteria food. Not necessarily a bad thing. However, Bacteria are pretty easy to cultivate. They multiply super rapidly, especially when fed sugary foods. On the flip side, fungi are a little bit more scarce, generally, I'm led to believe, in most soils. This is as easy as just steeping a little bit more compost in your water and letting the humic acid flow out. For that same reason, I also tend to steer away from using worm castings for my source of microbes, since those are very bacterially rich. Not saying they don't work. I know tons of people that use them to great effect, especially for growing a lot of annuals and veggies. They're going to go to town helping them take off in the spring. All of these are just a few extra considerations when it comes to brewing your aerated compost tea. If you have made compost and compost tea for a while and are looking to take it to the next level, I'll point out that indigenous microorganisms could be in your future this season. All of the aerated compost tea that I brew these days is actually liquid IMO, which is a combination of IMO4 and aerated compost tea. I use that as my foliar spray. I use Jadam Microbial solution, JMS, as my primary soil drench. That's a topic for another video. If you found any of this interesting, annoying, profound, challenging, or exciting, again, let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video and you want to dive deeper into the world of DIY liquid garden sprays, you will want to check out our in-depth beginner's guide to homemade liquid teas and ferments. As always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.